seminar. It is with great delight that I introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Gisela Heffes. Dr. Jefes is a professor of Latin American literature and culture at Rice University with a particular focus on literature, media, and the environment. She is the author of two monographs, Las ciudades imaginarias en la literatura latinoamericana and Políticas de la destrucción, poéticas de la preservación, apuntes para una lectura ecocrítica del medio ambiente en América Latina, the recipient of the LASA Southern Cone Humanities Honorable Mention in 2015. She has edited two collections of essays, one on the experience of displacement and translocation in the creative imagination of Spanish-American writers residing in the U.S., that one's entitled Poéticas de los Dislocamientos, and another one focused on the intersections between utopia and cities in Latin America, entitled Utopías Urbanas, Geopolítica del Deseo en América Latina. She was the guest editor for the special issue of Revista de Crítica Literaria Latinoamericana on Ecocrítica in 2014. Her most recent publications are the co-edited volumes the Latin American EcoCultural Reader, which my students in the environmental imagination class have read, and Pushing Past the Human in Latin American Cinema. Dr. Jefes has also written the novel Cocodrilos en la noche, published in 2020, and the bilingual poetry collection El cero móvil de su boca, in English, the zero mobile of its mouth. Along with George Handley, she is the co-president of ASLE, the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment. Please help me welcome Dr. Gisela Heffes.
Well, thank you. I am very honored and happy to be here. I am very thankful to Ana Maria for the invitation, as well as the mass program here at Trinity, and I am delighted to share time with so many different colleagues like Heather Sullivan, Norma Cantu, who hosted me already in her class, and Elseke, thank you so much for putting together the itinerary. As a scholar in the field of Latin American studies, I've been drawing on the vital terms and debates that are currently structuring the most important research in and across environmental studies, including the environmental humanities, in order to examine how the term environment fosters a questioning of the relations of power, agency, and responsibility to human and non-human environments. The anthropogenic crisis demands a review of the role that extractive politics, economies, and cultures have played vis-à-vis current ecosystems. It urges an innovative reflection to size the geological changes provoked by the scale and magnitude of human actions, especially those in the hands of the few. But what are the environmental humanities, and when and where did they emerge? Do we have a similar attempt in the field of Latin American studies? Which type of questions do they pose? In the book Environmental Humanities, published in 2017, Robert Emmett and David Knight note that one can trace the origins of the environmental humanities back more than a century, although the field originated most immediately through the confluence of simultaneous developments during the 1970s and the 1980s in departments of literature, philosophy, history, geography, gender studies, and anthropology. In the late 1990s, for instance, a cluster of Australian researchers working at the intersection of history, indigenous studies, anthropology, philosophy, political theory, and nonfiction writing adopted the name Ecological Humanities. And between 1991 and 1995, the MacArthur Workshop on Humanistic Studies of the Environment at MIT sought to transcend the common duality of nature versus culture by locating ecological problems in the behavior of human institutions, beliefs, and practices. Initiatives that combine natural and social sciences with humanities and encourage research across disciplines began to emerge during the 1990s. The field of environmental humanities has also been shaped by post-colonial and feminist studies, as well as by scholars working outside of Europe and the United States. These scholars critique the limited focus of earlier environmental histories and the literary canon of nature writing. They challenge the persistent anthropocentric and at times imperial bias of dominant ethical and political theories, and they pointed out that the very idea of humans standing outside of and controlling nature was based on a conception of the natural world that was passive and feminized. As a matter of fact, there was often an implicitly racialized conception of the natural world that depended on a restricted historical anthropos that was conceived as white, male, and European. Terms that may seem neutral, such as man and nature, have often masked unequal social relations and exploitation of resources. For literary critic Ursula Hayes, the environmental humanities envision ecological crisis fundamentally as questions of socioeconomic inequality, cultural difference, and divergent histories, values, and ethical frameworks. Scientific understanding and technological problem solving, essential as they are themselves, are shaped by such frameworks and stand to gain by situating themselves in this historical and sociocultural landscape. In the emergence of the environmental humanities, Hayes reminds us that this field does not propose a new object of study, a new humanistic perspective on a non-humanistic field, or a particular set of new methods, as they combine humanistic perspectives and methods that have already developed in half a dozen or so disciplines over the last 4 decades. As a new interdisciplinary matrix, as she defines it, it engages among several approaches with criticism of the wilderness ideal, a perspective that stems from developing countries by environmentalist scholars such as Joan Martinez-Allier and Ramachandra Guha. It explores the connection between social justice and the environment as demonstrated by critical geographer David Harvey, or it takes up environmentalist tropes such as place and toxicity as suggested by literary critic Lawrence Buell. While this interdisciplinary theoretical and critical framework of inquiry has evolved and expanded, how have the environmental humanities engaged or failed to engage Latin American, Caribbean, and/or Latino studies? And what are the Latin American contributions to environmental humanities? To answer this question, I propose that we focus on those primary sources that bring into focus the relationships between human societies and the more than human world in Latin America, from the earliest colonial period to the present. We need to provide an analysis of different historical key moments in Latin America and offer several examples of how different aesthetic, cultural, social, and political representations have been implicated in the ways we think and perceive nature. Sure enough, eco-criticism, and in a broader sense, environmental humanities, is a helpful tool to engage with these cultural works, since the term eco-criticism is a capacious one that encompasses a constellation of approaches that relies on different theoretical and critical frameworks. These critical and theoretical approaches have also been marked by several turns, from the affect turn, the spatial turn, the post-hegemonic turn, to the ontological turn, the indigenous studies turn, the material turn, and so forth. Some of the existing Latin American eco-critical scholarship includes the vegetal turn and the emergence of critical plant studies, studies on the intersections of landscape, extractivism and the legacy of colonization, works on the notions of heterogeneous landscapes, the decolonization of science, knowledge, and nature, posthumanism and the limits of the human, imaginary geographies and nation-state constructions vis-à-vis the tropics, reconfigurations of the Latin American canon, the interplay between text and context of the developmentalism period, literary counter-readings of the Amazon, extractivism and the search for El Dorado, transcultural materialism, liquid ecologies, dialectics, and slow violence. New cross-cutting initiatives have also emerged that follow in the path of new materialism, indigenous and post-colonial criticism, animal studies, and queer ecology. A recent attempt I have made to organize Latin American literature through the prism of an ecological critique was the co-editing with my colleague Jennifer French of the Latin American EcoCultural Reader. Some of the goals of this reader were to organize and cluster a huge aesthetic production in a way that made sense historically, to dig up, uncover, and bring to the fore those stories silenced and even erased by the hegemonic narratives of domination and power, to assemble these narratives in a way that provides a wider perspective of the rich Latin American production, and to foster some sort of reflection on how to decenter anthropocentric epistemologies, in other words, to decolonize knowledge. In this sense, it is important to underline that it takes up the contemporary exhaustion of dominant Western epistemologies as an opportunity to examine some of the alternatives that Latin American ecological thought offers, many of which have been present for decades. In order to trace the genealogies of Latin American ecological thought, it is crucial to examine the works of Amerindian intellectuals and activists, many of them situated in the Andean region, where indigenous environmental thought has recently acquired new political force and visibility. This methodology connects a wide array of literary and cultural materials with current theories such as post-colonialism, ecofeminism, new materialism, and Latin American eco-criticism. By analyzing and writing on a multitude of ecocultural texts from Latin America since the arrival of the first Europeans to the global ecological crisis that brought about the threat of mass extinction and catastrophic events such as flooding, droughts, wildfires, and now a pandemic, I'm particularly interested in the debates that have moved the field of environmental thought forward to its present engagement with the environmental justice movement and, in a broader sense, the ecocultural production of the global South. Some of the questions addressed here are historical and theoretical and span from how nature and the people that inhabit those natural environments have been implicated in structures of colonial and neo-colonial domination and exploitation, beginning with the European colonizers' insistence that the millions of people that they encountered in the Americas were living in a so-called state of nature. This colonizing paradigm of both domination and exploitation is visible with its own complexity in other regions of the global South. In a moment of increasing global climate change and environmental degradation, it is important to ask what are the stakes of studying environmental literature in Latin American context. I bring up this question because it is one that needs to be addressed and possibly further discussed later during the conversation. To answer this, it is necessary to draw from that scholarship that has been most productive in thinking about the relationship between nature and cultural productions in Latin America, and bring it into dialogue with important theoretical work that has already been undertaken by eco-critics in the Anglophone world in order to offer a new theoretical framework. Given the current circumstances, environmental humanities in the Latin American context is a joint response to the realities and urgencies of our present. Some of these pressing conditions are the accelerating and growing numbers of ecological devastations, from the increasingly frequent hurricanes and floodings to the even more often droughts and wildfires. These unnatural disasters are sparked or exacerbated by the effects of the anthropogenic climate change, which in turn are causing a massive species extinction, as well as the collapse of agriculture and other systems that support the Earth's humans' populations. Consider that in last September, the Audubon Society announced that the ivory-billed woodpecker, along with other 22 species, will be officially declared extinct in US, just to name a recent, perhaps familiar example for an American audience. In some way, the practice of Latin American eco-criticism aims at taking hold of the ecological crisis before our world, as such, disappeared forever. It follows Walter Benjamin's understanding of the past, as it can be sized only as an image which flashes up at the instant when it can be recognized and is never seen again. In this sense, it attempts to seize hold of the images of the region's environmental and unnatural history before they are lost in the rapidly accelerating processes of environmental degradation. As a genealogical undertaking, an ecological reading of Latin American literary and cultural production responds to the uncertainties of the present by reconfiguring the Latin American canon from a pre-Columbian past to the present. The goal is to create a history that sifts through layers of accumulated environmental catastrophes as well as ecological awareness and appropriation. This methodological approach reveals illustrations in complex patterns of sameness and difference that stretch through decades and centuries. From Amerindian ontologies, ecofeminism, popular national telluric imaginings, syncretic Afro-Latin American cultural practice, and the Pope's 2015 encyclical on the environment, all different varieties of Latin American environmental thought is evidence today, have genealogies that can be traced through continuities and ruptures as political and economic forms and technologies change, becoming increasingly complex. Furthermore, the survival and re-emergence of these various strains of Latin American environmental thought are inversely related to the operations of power that shape dominant ideologies and epistemologies while ellipsing others. Here, the term genealogy is used in a Foucauldian way. In other words, as a kind of scholarship that places local knowledges that are discontinuous, marginalized, and delegitimized into play against the unitary theoretical instance that claims to be able to filter them, organize them into a hierarchy in the name of a true body of knowledge, as well as the rights of a science that is in the hands of the few. A genealogy, therefore, operates as an anti-science. As an insurrection of knowledge that contests the centralizing power effects that are bound up with the institutionalization and workings of any scientific discourse organized in a society such as ours, as Foucault argued. What's more, this insurgency has been led in recent years by Amerindian intellectuals and activists. An eco-critical endeavor, therefore, must pay closer attention and afford more significance to Amerindian environmental knowledge, which also draws attention to what might be thought of as Creole ecologists. The term Creole is used here in Edouard Glissant's sense of processes of adaptation and hybridization on the part of humans and other species transported, often against their will, from Europe and Africa to the Americas, where they entered into complex and dynamic relations with local cultures and ecosystems. On view of this backdrop, how would a genealogical attempt look like? In order to address how a genealogical effort to rearrange the Latin American canon from a pre-Columbian past to the present can highlight, in a broader sense, the contributions of Latin America to the environmental humanities, a genealogical approach must seek to retrieve how nature has been and continues to be implicated in structures of colonial and neo-colonial domination and exploitation. It must also address the survival and continuity of alternative intellectual traditions, including the recent reemergence of long-suppressed Amerindian ontologies and epistemologies into the political domain, along with some of their implications for the work that we do as scholars of Latin American cultural production. One of the most important contributions of eco-criticism as a new critical tool of inquiry is the assertion that concepts of space and place should become categories of literary and cultural analysis, much as gender, social class, race, and colonialism had earlier. American eco-critic Sherry Kloffelty argued in 1996 that there are three primary areas of concern: the assessment and critique of the ways that nature, broadly understood, is represented in works of popular and canonical literature, the recuperation and reconsideration of the marginalized tradition of literature that focuses on nature and place, including particular places, and the theoretical exploration of the symbolic construction of species, including the human, the relation to the environment, and the articulation of alternatives not based on the dualism that have conventionally structured Western thought. Since Kloffelty published the influential Eco-Criticism Reader 25 years ago, the field of eco-criticism has grown and diversified in important ways. But for the most part, eco-criticism started out as a wide movement within literary and cultural studies. It has become more racially and geographically diverse over time, with important ties to the urban notion of the global environmental justice movement, which asserts the rights of all persons to share equally the benefits of a healthy environment and works to rectify the disproportionate incidence of environmental contamination in communities inhabited by minorities, whether defined by class, ethnicity, or race. It intersects with what Ramachandra Guha and Joan Martinez Allier have theoretically defined as environmentalism of the poor, a rural third world notion that has been echoed more recently by Rob Nixon's seminal work of post-colonial eco-criticism, Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor, published in 2011. Here, Nixon examines some of the strategies writers have developed to overcome the temporal and geographic displacements that conceal the often catastrophic effects of environmental and biological hazards created in the global north and deployed overwhelmingly in the south. This genealogical project undertakes what has been defined as the coloniality of nature. Latin America is the locus of important ecological disputes in the present. From the political battles over the conservation of tropical rainforests in Amazonia and Central America to the Nicaraguan government's plans for a second interoceanic canal, the ongoing controversies surrounding the allocation of water resources in the Andes, which are often related to glacier melt and the long history of mining in the region, the pervasive popular protest against the effects of monocrop agriculture, soil and water system toxification, oil spills, air pollution, and the abandonment of regional foodsheds. Of course, these are only some examples. As you know, the so-called abundance of natural resources the European colonizers encountered in the New World created the conditions of possibility for an economy based on the exploitation of human beings and non-human nature through the extraction of mineral wealth, monoculture, black slavery, and the encomienda system. Despite technological, economic, and political transformations at the local, regional, and geopolitical levels, this economy subsists today. The uncontrolled exploitation of natural resources has been a constant in the economic history of Latin America. The coloniality of nature is a concept put forth by cultural theorist Walter Mignolo to convey the enduring effects of the mutual complicity among economic interests, symbolic constructions of difference, and the development of scientific methodologies in the centuries following Europeans' arrival in the Americas. The production of European modernity took place at the material and discursive level simultaneously. While I will not address here all the epistemological shifts that took place during the 16th and 17th centuries, it is worthy to note that this was a crucial period in the development of Western philosophy and science, and that only 150 years after Columbus' arrivals to Hispaniola, today the Dominican Republic and Haiti, French philosopher Rene Descartes published his famous Discourse on Method, a seminal text of philosophical and scientific modernity in the West, which represents a distinct break with previous traditions in that it bluntly professes the superiority of humans over nature, a new rationality constructed on modes of empirical inquiry that were developed by agents of Spain and Portugal and would evolve side by side with consumer capitalism and the autonomous individual of liberal political philosophy. However, Descartes was only one out of several scientists and philosophers that, as Caroline Merchant argues in her book Autonomous Nature, introduced a major transformation during the 17th century. The origins of both experimental and mathematical methods that were key to the rise of modern science took shape under natural philosophers such as Francis Bacon, Rene Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, Baruch Spinoza, Isaac Newton, and Gottfried Leibniz, among others. As Merchant notes, during the 8 decades that intervened between Bacon's publication of The Advancement of Learning in 1605 to Newton's Principia Mathematica in 1687, a new grasp of human power over and prediction of nature arose. Taking all this into consideration, a genealogical project also aims to track the shift in the production of scientific knowledge in the early modern colonial Atlantic world, while also seeking alternative epistemologies that can help us to break the duality of the human-non-human subject-object. It is particularly interested in the ways of knowing that were left behind by the questionable idea of progress of Western scientific modernity, for what it recognizes Renaissance intellectuals like José de Acosta, along with those writings dedicated to the lives of religious women and men who practiced what historian Jorge Canizares Esguerra referred to as colonization as spiritual gardening. In this sense, it formulates a genealogy that harkens back to the 17th century Americas, where the moral and spiritual improvement of the human person was often undertaken through the cultivation of certain plant species, be it in the convent gardens and mission fields of the Iberian territories or the Protestant farmsteads. This assemblage of self and soil continued well into the 18th century. Some Enlightenment intellectuals like the Count Buffon provoked the polemic that will become known as the dispute of the New World, with their dismissive assessment of American flora and fauna. This will trigger, in turn, that Creole writers from Chile to Mexico defended their homelands. But what is interesting and gives you a wider view on the interconnections between nature, cultural representations, and commodities is that some of these writings were rooted in the geographic space of the Americas, dominating the areas of history and literature with, as critic Santa Arias contended, texts that exalt the land and evoke the landscape, including the human and natural diversity of the regions. Historically, these 18th century evocations will prefigure the correlation between nature and the nation-state typical of Romantic nationalisms. With this in mind, it is impossible to ignore that throughout all the decades of Spanish-American cultural production, the notion that nature is not a repository of spiritual values, but a danger to be overcome in the interest of establishing a modern and civilized nation, has prevailed. A great example is the 1845 publication of Domingo Faustino Sarmiento's Facundo, Civilization and Barbarism, which famously represents the pampas that extend south of the Argentine capital with an image of the desert as a void, whose abolishing power resists human imagination. As you all know, the combination of wild and settled spaces with violence and political unrest is an unmistakable component of Latin American political thought from Sarmiento's time up to the present. Sarmiento's ambivalent conceptualization of wilderness largely complemented economic developments of the late 19th century, when the massive influx of British and later US capital created new infrastructure aimed at getting primary products, wood, bananas, beef, and so on, to distant markets. As a matter of fact, the frontier, that liminal space between the settled coast and the wild hinterland of the interior, became a site of intense economic activity and extraordinary environmental degradation, at the very same time that the products themselves became the new key to national identities, be they, as Venezuelan anthropologist and historian Fernando Coronil put it, oil nations, banana republics, or plantation societies, for example, or broadly as underdeveloped or backward nations. With the commodification of daily life, the predominance of the culture industry and the conversion of social life into a society of spectacle as the defining attributes of the logic of consumer capitalism, the latter expands to nearly make up the totality of the social sphere in the 20th century. As one would expect, conceptualizations of nature have also changed. What I just described is important for the understanding of the role of nature, commodities, and cultural representations from a historical vantage point in Latin America. Amerindian knowledge is almost diametrically opposed to Western knowledge. This is because many Amerindian ontologies are not anthropocentric. Whereas Western cultures, theistic or otherwise, have tended to understand humankind as occupying a special place in the universe and pursuing a special destiny outside the potential of non-human animals, Amerindian cultures do not differentiate hierarchically between human and non-human species, or, for that matter, between nature and culture. Anthropologists Philippe de Colas and Eduardo Viveiras de Castro have examined and shown how certain peoples visualize their insertion into the environment in a manner altogether different from our own. Descartes, for instance, has demonstrated that they regard themselves not as social collective managing their relations with the ecosystems, but rather as simple components of a greater whole within which no real discrimination is established between humans and non-humans. The reemergence of long-suppressed Amerindian and border epistemologies is one of the most vital developments of the late 20th century and one with profound implications for politics and intellectual life in the Americas, including eco-criticism and the environmental humanities more broadly. Drawing inspiration from recent political events in Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, where the indigenous popular movement has conjured sentient entities such as mountains, water, and soil, what the West calls nature, into the public arena, anthropologist Marisol de la Cadena argues that indigeneity as a historical formation exceeds the Western understanding of politics as usual, that is, of politics as a field in which rational human beings dispute the power to represent themselves and others vis-a-vis the state. According to de la Cadena, indigenity's current political emergence challenges the separation of nature and culture that underpins the prevalent notion of politics and the social contract on which it is predicated. Thus, the politics proposed by contemporary indigenous movements is pluralistic not because of its enactment of bodies marked by gender, race, ethnicity, or sexuality, but because it conjures non-human actors to the political arena. Indigenous environmental politics is closely tied to indigenous claims to land and the vindication of indigenous intellectual traditions and cultural forms. In the context of the current attack against indigenous communities and the territories they occupy throughout the Americas, these claims could not be more urgent. Consider, for example, 3 relatively recent films that trace different case studies of what I defined decapitated mountains. Cielo Abierto, or Open Sky, by Carlos Ruiz was released in 2007. When Clouds Clear, by Daniel Bernstein and Anne Slick in 2008, and Operación Diablo, or The Devil's Operation, by Stephanie Boyd in 2010. Modern extractive mechanisms and equipment enables a spectacle of removal, such as mountains drifting away. Not surprisingly, over the last 2 decades, Latin American cinema has brought a landscape of decapitated mountains into view. Mountains with no head, with their tops chopped off, bald and bare, like the head of a Dominican friar. I contend that these films set in motion what I call decapitation resistance. By this, I refer to a strategy based on the use of alternative knowledges that dispute and aim to reverse the epistemological mechanisms established by mining companies and extractive capital. Decapitation resistance implies an undisciplined knowledge, one that's not necessarily harkened back to the Lacadena's ontological politics. On the contrary, undisciplined knowledge challenges both hegemonic and homogenizing discourses by putting forward a heterogeneous hybrid episteme that binds together spaces and temporalities, modern and traditional customs, and material and digital risk assessments to generate collective action, namely resistance. By formulating a particular aesthetic through documentary films, this episteme organizes a unique practice that brings together human-driven anthropogenic change, politics, and environmentalism. The documentaries appeal to this form of undisciplined knowledge to contest the imposition of what Rob Nixon called the official landscape. After all, decapitation resistance aims to preserve and in some cases restore the threatened vernacular landscape. These films are examples of an eco-cinema that operates as a collaborative initiative, a type of practice that creates, as Belinda Smale argues, a reciprocal social agenda among filmmakers, technicians, and main actors that goes beyond empathy and generates a recognition of the other in its specificity through a dissident gaze. The 3 documentaries address ongoing conflicts in Latin America since the 1990s, when Andean countries opened their economies to private investment through neoliberal policies and deregulation. As a result, there was a rise of extractive practices through open pit mining that involved slicing the tops off of mountains or emptying lakes. Operación Diablo introduces the question of gold mining and the response by the local community that live in the region, who take on an activist role comprising political resistance, radical protest, and collective meetings. Because of the immediate threat to their environments, they're forced to learn in greater detail about the perils of mining, a task they achieve by connecting with other communities. Cielo Abierto takes place in La Rioja, Argentina, where a Canadian mining company, Barrick Gold Corporation, plans to explore the Famatina mountain in search of gold. And When Clouds Clear takes place in Junín, Ecuador, where a community of farmers who have been living in the mountains, raising crops for many years, have to confront the Canadian mining firm Ascendant Copper. The three documentaries illustrate the ongoing tensions between local residents and transnational corporations by foregrounding the complicity that local authorities establish with foreign firms, who, paradoxically, they assist in suppressing local dissidents through force and violence. This takes the form of repressive crowd dispersal or even more brutal actions, such as in Operación Diablo, where the audience witnesses how a paramilitary squad hired by the company tortures and kills many locals. Conflicts over natural resources are linked to different materials and/or sectors, from fossil fuels to mineral, timber, agriculture, aquaculture, and water, as well as access to land and/or bodies of water, from which natural resources can be extracted. These conflicts, as a matter of fact, can be seen as a continuation of colonial land and resource appropriation that established systems of dispossession and control. These documentaries play an important role in interrogating the contrasts that emerge from the clash of the local and the global. Decapitation resistance means to contest or even reverse the demonizing rhetoric used by the local media to describe the activist. This demonizing rhetoric depicts protesters as criminals, terrorists, and anti-state militants. Peaceful marchers that block the roads to the mine, like in When Clouds Clear, end with the police firing tear gas to brutally repress demonstrators. The two images featured here provide a closer glimpse of the political force in two distinct situations. While Figure 1 frames the cover police face through a tight close-up, Figure 2 displays the police presence by way of a medium shot of one officer accompanied by three other officers in the background. What is striking about Figure 1 is its enactment of perverse intimacy with state power and violence. The image doesn't display police violence per se, but the helmet, gas mask, and bulletproof vest suggest the disproportionate response by the police force to peaceful protesters. Significant, too, is the choice of a close-up that highlights the officer's eyes, which can be seen through the clear plastic of the mask. The intimacy of this shot perhaps serves as a way of communicating the search for an emotional clue hidden under the bulky suit. In contrast, Figure 2 departs from such intimacy and leaves less room for ambiguity. The still captures the one-dimensional anger of the police officer, his hand pulling the gun, while the other three men look behind them to where the conflict will unfold. Farther in the distance, a local bystander can be seen. Examined together, the two images generate an effect of anger and frustration in the audience. Moreover, they illustrate the problematic tensions that define and organize a relentless conflict. When lined up together, the three documentaries subvert the prevailing narrative that foreign corporations, mining companies, and the local states have put forth. Together, they evoke an undisciplined knowledge to regain threatened landscapes through collective dissidence as well as hybrid modes of world-making. Yet, it is important to be wary of the reification of cultural difference, including through a false politics of authenticity and essentialized identities. For Eduardo Godínez and others, indigenous and non-indigenous intellectuals alike, the enshrining of the rights of nature within the Ecuadorian constitution has prompted a wider reflection on the idea of nature having intrinsic value. Value, in other words, not assigned by humans, which would be a passage toward broader recognition of nature as a bearer of rights, that is, a subject of rights. By the same token, recent years have demonstrated the fecundity at the edges of cultural fields, as witnessed in the flourishing of innovative aesthetic forms that draw on multiple artistic and cultural traditions, media, and genres. These works destabilize boundaries, categories, and identities. Furthermore, they have proliferated in recent years as artists and intellectuals are spurred by the crisis of climate change and environmental degradation to experiment with innovative artistic expressions. In some cases, non-Indigenous artists and intellectuals are deeply engaged with non-Western traditions. In other cases, they're breaking boundaries within what remains a recognizable Western heritage, blurring the borders between science and art or human and animal. The logic of political ontologies associated with popular environmentalism in Latin America is legible and accessible when those ontologies are situated in multiple contexts. The collective and pan-disciplinary project of articulating ways of knowing that do not rely on the epistemological separation of subject and object, and the long struggle by Latin American intellectuals toward the decolonization of knowledge, which can be understood as the extrication of knowledge production from a state rationality that directs itself toward the consolidation of resources in the hands of the privileged few. While this interdisciplinary theoretical and critical framework of inquiry has evolved and expanded, how have the environmental humanities engaged or failed to engage Latin American studies, Caribbean and/or Latino studies? It is worth making a pause for a second because it is important to address a significant difference between Latin American studies in the United States, or more precisely, outside the academic boundaries of Latin America and within the continent and/or the islands. For instance, what is more frequently used in Latin America, environmental studies or environmental humanities? As a matter of fact, while humanidades ambientales or environmental humanities is sometimes used, it consists more of an imported term similar to eco-criticism, to cite another example, than a paradigm of inquiry that has originated in Latin America. Furthermore, in this context, the term political ecology, in Spanish ecología política, is used more often. While there are parallel conversations that are taking place both north or south of the border, the theoretical frameworks are sometimes different. For instance, the use of the word political is absent in environmental humanities. This is maybe because, from the perspective of the latter, we could perhaps practice environmental humanities without a direct engagement with politics. On the contrary, politics are pervasive and ever-present in Latin America. This distinction replicates other dynamics embedded in each methodological approach. In a recent book, Mexican economist Rene Descartes, for instance, warns us that by facing the colonizing and exploitative character of the geopolitics of globalization and sustainable development, a series of critical and creative responses are emerging in the conflicted field of political ecology led by Latin American and Third World peoples. I would argue that there are some relevant questions that have recently traversed the field and tackled the role of universities and academic institutions. For instance, how can both literature and art become a critical gesture, a practice as research that contributes to cultural institutions as hubs of knowledge production? How can we redistribute power in the politics of knowledge? I'm here thinking of scholars in Latin America vis-a-vis the Anglo-American world. Can academics in the Anglo-American world breach university boundaries and get involved with communities outside of academia? Can we talk about internal colonialism within countries of the Global South? This is a list of pressing issues that are shifting the field of Latin American studies in conversation with environmental humanities, political ecology, as well as other methods and approaches such as inter- and transdisciplinary practices that move beyond anthropocentric knowledges and aesthetics. I will finish up with a call for an insurrection of knowledges. As a Latin American studies scholar that happens to also be from Latin America, I encourage others interested in the field or more broadly in the global south to look at the reverse side of these still ongoing structures of colonial and neocolonial domination and exploitation, and to take seriously Walter Mignolo's invitation to look for the silences in official histories in books, in encyclopedias, and on the web that assume historical narrative and what happened are one and the same thing. Simply put, to illuminate how history has produced silences and absences. The other side of this process is the systemic suppression of forms of knowledge that do not abide by the modern Western epistemology that divides subject from object and places them in opposition to each other. Thank you.
So since dominance and colonial domination is so structurally embedded into the United States as a nation and really all of the world, how do we begin to truly appreciate all of the contributions of the Latinx community and help appreciate the intrinsic value of those around us?
That's a very good question. So I teach environmental justice. So this is very connected to what I teach, and I usually, we always kind of cover Latin American or Global South material, but environmental justice is also about communities in disadvantage, around the corner. So I think we should maybe start looking close and what's going on, in the next, in the next blogs or around us. So I think that framework of thinking in terms of periphery and central, centrality, which is very proper and adequate to think, the relationship of Latin America vis-a-vis the global north, as well as the global south more generally, can be used as a frame to transpolate into, the internal and disproportionate inequalities that are in this country. And I would talk about climate justice, but I would talk about health justice, food justice, and many other things that are really prevalent here and have to be addressed. So I think we can use that framework, to kind of start thinking in a more local way.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So you touched on the contributions of Amerindians within the Latin American context. I was wondering if indigenous peoples within the United States have been acknowledged, as the field of academia in the United States is evolving towards the contributions towards ecological humanities, or is that something that Latin America has that the United States hasn't yet started to develop?
I think it has been started. I am not an American scholar, or American studies scholar, so I will not be able to trace in the same way that I can trace in the context of Latin America since the arrival of the Europeans. To my knowledge, there is some attempts to kind of, incorporate that, but I do not know to what extent that will be similar to the context of Latin America, and I really don't feel comfortable answering something that I do not know. I do know, from hearing other panels and reading, my impression is that it is, but I don't know how much has been reached out. And in the context of Latin America, what I'm also interested is how not only that knowledge is kind of becoming more central, in the context of politics, but also in the context of academics, as they are getting more recognition, especially, for instance, in Brazil. Many thinkers now are being recognized, and artists as well, and there is a little bit more of an opening into trying to incorporate or introduce those knowledges, those epistemologies into current methodological and epistemological ways of learning and thinking, but also distribution knowledge, how knowledge is distributed and how is it possible to create a more collective way of addressing all these issues that are so urgent. Yeah, I wish I knew more, but it's not my field, so I can't really, I will maybe make a huge mistake, so I don't want to answer.
You mentioned, and also in the EcoCultural Reader, you have a section about developmentalism. How do you feel like, or what is the path sort of forward for development today? And I know you mentioned sustainable development and sort of that channel. Is that something where Westerners sort of need to just step back and look at the Amerindian knowledge, at the sort of, you mentioned like the insurrection against science, like does that need to be the focal point, and the current institutions support the local movements, or how do you see the interaction between those two powers, or I guess like dynamics?
I'm not sure if I understood correctly the question, but in terms of developmentalism, which is a phase especially very important during the 1950s and 60s, this is a moment where there are a lot of new measures introduced, like in Mexico, like the Green Revolution, the industrialized movement in Argentina run by Raúl Presbich. So this is a moment where there is an attempt to industrialize and rely on our local sources, instead of exporting raw material and imported refined products that come from the global north. As we move forward, this idea of developmentalism, I think, is very embedded with this idea of progress. It's this idea of we need to grow and grow, economic growth. And I think what's happening now is that we're trying to degrowth, and there is a lot of scholars and activists and artists that are thinking about degrowth and slow thinking, slow eating, slow learning, because the notion or the idea of progress and the idea of developing is like you're going into a direction, and this is kind of like, where it ends, right? Like growth. What is economic growth? I know what is economic growth defined by somebody like a finance or in the economic world, but is how much we can grow and at the cost of what, or in detriment of what. So I think that's something that is becoming more present, but it's hard, as we write about economic growth and degrowth and slow thinking, we're still embedded in a context where we have to submit papers, we have to submit articles, we have to run from one place to another in a car or fly. So it's really challenging. I think as we, as academics and also as teachers, we can help, and provide more of a context to our students and our families and relatives in terms of how to start thinking about all these different issues. But it's not easy given the fact that we are embedded in a system that is constantly growing. So there are other places that in Latin America, for instance, there are a lot of people that are more more interested in that kind of like in going more in that direction. So there are people that are volunteering, going working with with Amazonian communities, providing them with help with technology, and they're more like in tune with a mindset that is not as accelerated, but is a very complicated and the negotiations between what we do and how we think things should be are not easy.
Yeah, and I have a follow-up to that. I think, like you said, there's so many challenges. Where can we find hope within that too? Because we're in such a context and time of uncertainty and just sort of this increasing also like cultural clashes, both domestically and with conversations about globalization internationally. How do we find hope in all of that?
I know, I hear you, because I have to tell you that a class on environmental justice is depressing. It's extremely depressing, and what I do in my class is I usually work with the we analyze and we discuss different case studies and literature as well and art, but we also come up with solutions. And since it's a very interdisciplinary class and I have students coming from engineering and biology, I push them into thinking how would you do things different. And I always tell them in terms of hope that they will be at some point in a position of power and in a position that they can make decisions and decide, and that whatever they're learning and they're informed by, is going to have an impact in what they decide. And this is a class that I teach that was students asked for this class. So there is really like a generation of students like you that are more interested in a different future. So I think that is going to have a big impact in how things evolve. And I am really hopeful because you see the students are like very, very motivated and very interested in doing things that are sustainable, but sustainable, not greenwashing, right? Like really sustainable. And if they're going to build a bridge, they want to know that that bridge doesn't go over a community, or they don't want to have extract water that belongs to another community. So there are all these things there that are present, and as you start thinking about solutions, then you can also realize that things can be done different. Maybe the growth is not going to be as monumental, but it's going to still, you can install water, you can do a lot of different things, but you can do it in a way that is more, I don't want to use the word sustainable, but it's more like in line with the values of the people that inhabit those places. So it's not invasive, it's not violent, and it's not appropriation of resources, which is what is sometimes. But yes, hope is super important, and I do have hope.
Gisela, thank you.
I guess it's like refers to hope and what we're talking about, but does like ecological humanities like concern a plan to recover imperially erase indigenous cultures' way of thinking towards nature, to give an example for a current planetary attitude like that is based on these values, but is also aided by like these indigenous values, but is also aided by like the series of disciplines in the Western and all over that have been researching how and why like we should decolonize nature or decolonize this knowledge, just not under an identified umbrella yet. And I guess like that's what
can I ask you just a small favor? I think I'm going deaf a little bit, but can you not move the microphone? Because when it moves, it kind of comes back and leaves, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so deaf that I can't hear you.
Okay, I'm just gonna start over then. Okay, so basically I'm asking if ecological humanities is basically an umbrella of like of knowledge and interdisciplinary knowledge that researching that has not been like identified until like recently, but like everyone has been thinking of the same thing, that we should decolonize this knowledge, and like we understand that there's gap between like you know, nature and culture, and like we are understanding this, but like we're finally like coming together, and like I feel like this is like the force that needs to be talked about. So I feel like, you know, it is depressing, but like it is also hopeful, like, you know, in the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And just the fact that, you know, you're thinking of that and you're bringing that into the conversation, that's a really good, you know, important contribution, and also that you have that in mind. So yes, definitely.
Thank you, Gisela. It's wonderful to have you here and to hear your talk, and to hear my students. I just have two questions for you. I'm sorry, two questions, but one I'll ask really quickly, and then maybe you can answer afterwards. And then the second one is broader. The first one is, my students here are from my science fiction and environment class, and we're currently talking about environmental justice as portrayed in science fiction on kind of alien landscapes. And we're about to talk about Avatar and Le Guin's book, and on the word for world is forest. And I mention that because I know my students are super interested in the perspective of the indigenous, and I'm wondering if you could give me some titles that I could recommend and take note of for perspectives on different views of understandings of the world. So that's my first question, is getting some actual specific references from Latin America. And the second one is then on political ecology. I'm fascinated with this attempt to come up with a different term to talk about this, and how you've done that in Latin America. And I know I worked with a colleague for a German journal, and we talked about how you do it in German. And German is just basically translated the English terms, right? Ökokritik, because they don't have, you know, German always has a word for everything. But this challenge to find a word to describe the environmental humanities. And what's interesting is none of the German terms have political or politics in them. I'm wondering, does that not open it up more to then political science and other maybe social sciences? This sort of term to me suggests something rather than environmental humanities. I mean, if eco-criticism is basically literary studies, political ecology to me sounds like something much even broader. Am I right there, or does that still really be about art and literature?
So actually political ecology comes more from the social sciences, and Latin Americans, at least to my knowledge, are very reluctant to use the word ecocrítica, which would be the Spanish version. Very reluctant. They think it's a really important term. So I've been in debates that they are not interested, but on the other hand, little by little, is kind of getting there. And this is interesting because sometimes you feel like it's kind of like it's a moment of introduction of something that creates some awareness, and there is like a reaction to, oh, this is coming from, you know, from United States, so we can use it. But then, well, what do we use? You know, like it's really ecocrítica it makes sense. I mean, it's like the Anthropocene. You know, it's a really debatable word, and since, you know, we have started to use that, there are like 20 more words to use, and there are entire debates about that. But I do think that the proliferation of terms helps to think or to rethink and to revisit, you know, terms. So in the context of humanidades ambientales, which is what you're saying, like environmental humanities, they did not come up yet, as to my knowledge, with a word that is different from ecocrítica. I don't know of anything else. But I do think, and I do know, that they don't like to use it too much. They don't like to. And so you will see more aestheticas, like aesthetics of the environment, you know, like a more philosophy, more like environmental languages, but not ecocrítica. There's really like a reluctance there to use it. And in terms of science fiction, the other question, that's a great question. You know, it's very interesting because science fiction is a really minor genre in Latin America. It did not even have, I know that here is like a second tier type of genre, but here at least you have the movies, you know, you have the adult novels, young adult novels, and all that commercialization of the genre. But in Latin America, there's not that much. It's right now, in the last years, that people are starting to write more. And I have some titles that I can give you now, or I can give you afterwards. But yes, there's some writers writing now. And I was actually talking to a writer last week who is teaching environmental fictions, and he was telling me, now that I'm reading all this, I'm starting to write science fiction because I am so informed, but even if it's theoretical material, I am so influenced by what I'm reading that is creating this new kind of reemergence of. There is science fiction. I did work a lot with utopian novels, for instance, at the beginning of the 20th century. They're not science fiction. I mean, if we have to kind of abide by the categories and how the definition is, the role of science is much minor, so it's more like, I would say, dystopian than science fiction. And there are some that are really environmental, without thinking of the environment in the way we would think now. But they are really, this one that I worked a lot, which is from 1914, but it's not translated, that is an anarchist. Utopia/dystopia, and is written by this Franco-Argentine author. And the houses, it's very descriptive, as most utopias are, very, a lot of details, but the characters are vegetarians, the houses are built of glass, animals are liberated, there are animal rights. I wish it were translated. And there are a lot of issues that appear that are really, really kind of, avant la lettre. And then there is another one that also is a little bit more scientifically oriented, and it also is more about food sovereignty. So that's really interesting too, but it's not translated, and they're really kind of hidden, or kind of like these are books that have not impact. Like, I found them just, by doing research, but science fiction is really not very, very present genre. But now what is the most present is Gothic, right? Like, you can ask Ana Maria about that, but is what writers are writing a lot in the context of the Anthropocene, and their imagination is going into that direction. In Latin America, it's about Gothic narratives, where there is a mix between the Anthropocene, the end of the world, very scatological, and also like a whole kind of scenario where characters are either like zombies, or and also the backgrounds are very very deadly. But some of them are translated, so like Fever Dream will be one that you would like to read, but it's not a science fiction.
Yeah. First of all, gracias. Really enjoyed your visit to my class and the lecture today. I have a couple of comments, and I love the term decapitation resistance.
Thank you.
You've got a good one there, and I think it can be a metaphor for a lot of other things. So thank you for that. And then the conundrum about whether we are contributing and being complicit by the work we do in being against what we are saying we're doing. So that's one that is really at the core, I think, of what happens when we still think with a Western mindset. And the shift, that huge paradigm shift, to see the world from a non-Western perspective. I think that's the challenge, because then we become not complicit, but part of the solution as well. And that was once, it kept going around when you were talking about.
Yeah, when you're saying that, I think about Joaquin Torres Garcia, right? The map of Latin America inverted.
Yes,
yeah.
So it's inverted.
Yeah.
And the thinking then becomes inverted. And the other was just a comment. I'm trying to work through concepts that are indigenous from the global south, like senti pensante. And there's another one I don't even know how to pronounce from the Aymara about past, present, and future. And it's very Buddhist in a way, because everything is happening at once. And trying to work those ideas into theoretical constructs for analyzing culture. And they're very useful because, one, they destabilize the one that we already know, and I think a more fruitful and more effective description of what actually is happening, especially with the environment. And then finally, the Mexican Gothic, I don't know if you know the novel that came out. It's a Canadian writer, but she's Mexican, and it's about the house and the plants. I mean, it just, you have to read it.
I will, yes.
Because it's got a lot of the stuff that I think would interest you. Una vez más, just thank you very much for the work you do.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I was thinking about that.
Mexican Gothic.
I was ahorita. Quiero leerla. Sí. México.
No, pero es cierto que la ciencia ficción en América Latina